Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Northern Road Link Virtual Open House number 5 meeting, focusing on the selection of the preferred corridor. Unfortunately, we were not able to have our final open house in Geraldton, our final in-person open house in Geraldton, that is, on February 26th due to weather conditions. So in lieu of that, we're conducting a virtual edition. My name is Don Parkinson. I work with Atkins Realis, and with me are my colleagues Ange Brooks of Atkins Realis and Michelle Nazir of Dillon Consulting. And as I mentioned, tonight we're going to be discussing the process of selecting the preferred corridor, which is the point we are at currently in the Northern Road Link Environmental Assessment Project. Now, if you have any questions, during the presentation, you will probably see a call-in number on your screen. That number is 844-722. There it is. 844-722-4300. That's 844-722-4300. Call or text that number, and we will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. And what we're talking about when we talk about a corridor is not the exact position of the road, but a 2 kilometer wide area of land and water within which the road would sit. So for planning purposes, what this does is give us an area to focus on, and the 2 kilometer width gives us room to adjust the position of the road based on any other information we might get that we haven't gotten so far, basically. So in terms of what we're going to talk about tonight, we've got we're going to go through the basic method for evaluating the corridor alternatives. Initially, then we're going to talk about the identified corridor options. We're going to get into the inputs to the process of evaluating the corridors, which are factors, criteria, and indicators. We'll talk about the weighting and scoring system used, limitations of the data and the modeling process, the results. We will show you the preferred corridor, and then we're going to talk after that about next steps going forward. So if we move on to the next slide, this one talks about sort of an overview of all the steps involved. And basically we start by doing what's called a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis, or SWOT analysis. So this is sort of a subjective kind of way of looking at each of the corridor options, looking at the good things and bad things, or advantages and disadvantages of each. So that's sort of our preliminary screening tool that we use. And then from there, we identify the corridor options to proceed to multi-criteria analysis, or MCA, which is the actual process of going through a very detailed analysis using input data collected from the project and other sources, and then that ends up producing results in the end that we use to help identify as a preferred corridor. So step 3 is the identification of factors, criteria, and indicators for the multi-criteria analysis. Those are the inputs basically into the model. What we use going into the process of using the software tool to help us identify the most preferred corridor. And then steps 4 and 5 are basically running the model and rerunning the model. So loading the data in and then going back and forth as data, as we get new layers of data or we update layers of data. And then from there we get the results, and from the results we're able to identify apply the scoring system and come up with a means by which to sort of objectively, in a measurable way, identify a preferred corridor alternative. And then after that, we go to step 7, which is essentially now, and that is taking the feedback from Indigenous communities, from stakeholders, from the general public, any other feedback they might have at this point, and factoring that in, and then finally finalizing the selection of the preferred corridor. So if we move to the next slide, this dives a little bit deeper into the SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis. And in 2021, we had two initial corridors, the existing corridor west and the existing corridor east. In 2024, we added corridors that were requested by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, or IAC. Um, and these were related to caribou concerns. So we added the West 1 corridor and the West 2 corridor. Then in 2025, we conducted another SWOT analysis, and that concluded that the existing corridor west was the most favorable. So that one moved forward with the existing corridor east as the two that would then go to sort of the final round of this process, which is the multi-criteria analysis. So this next slide basically describes the different corridor options. And the most important thing to remember here is that in a given area, so going from one point to another point along this general route, there might be different ways of doing that. And so because of that, we end up with different options that we can put through the process. So as you could probably see on the image here, there are a number of different alternatives, and all of these alternatives would then go through the process of through that multi-criteria analysis, um, where we identify the preferred corridor. Moving on to the next slide, as I mentioned before, the inputs to the evaluation of the corridors are basically factors, criteria, and indicators, and I'll get into those exactly what those are in a minute. But these are typically anchored or tied to what was presented in the environmental assessment terms of reference, the approved environmental assessment terms of reference, which is basically the recipe for the environmental assessment. Also, and then the federal equivalent is the impact assessment, tailored impact statement guidelines, or TISG, and as well as so these factors, criteria, and indicators, and the valued components that they're associated with were identified by government agencies, by technical experts working on the project, by Indigenous communities, by stakeholders, and the general public. So we received input through this entire process from all these different interests, and that allowed us to identify basically the inputs into the model. And these inputs were used to complete, as I mentioned, this multi-criteria analysis, or MCA, that allows us to compare the advantages and disadvantages of the corridor options in great detail. And the way this happens is through the use of computer software known as geographic information systems. So what it involves is taking data layers, input data layers that cover the same geographic same geographic area, and overlaying them on each other, and then looking at what the values are for each of the layers in each corresponding area as you overlay them, and then compiling all of that together. So you're crunching through a lot of different layers and a lot of different types of information, And then so this is all GIS data or geospatial data, which is geographically referenced data, and and then it produces results which allow us to identify a preferred corridor based on the scores that are produced. So, you know, these GIS layers, as I mentioned, they're generated from our field work in many cases. Um, they're they come from a lot of the layers can come from background studies that have been done in the area, data sets that have been compiled by government agencies and others. Uh, but a lot of it has to do with the project specific field surveys. So, for example, if we're conducting studies as part of the project um, on caribou, for example, we may have layers that are produced based on the caribou data in terms of where the caribou were during different times of year. So that's just an example. In terms of, if we move to the next slide, in terms of what are factors, criteria, and indicators, explaining what those are, factors are sort of an umbrella term. They're a general term that captures or a general category, I guess. So an example might be biological environment. That's probably the easiest one to follow. Within biological environment, which is a big category, you can have many different what you call criteria, which are subsets of components of the biological environment that are considered to be important. So, for example, in this case, it could be caribou, wolverine, bats, fish and fish habitat, wetlands. And then associated with each criteria or criterion, you have indicators. And indicators are what is being measured for each criterion. And so this is a way of sort of measuring impacts of the project. So, for example, if we look at something like fish and fish habitat, um, we could identify the area that the road, if a road goes across a water course, and there is a need for a watercourse crossing, such as a bridge or a culvert, um, fish habitat would be impacted by that. So that gets factored into, um, and it becomes part of the layer of impacted fish and fish habitat areas from the project. And I'm now going to pass the presenting baton over to Ange Brooks, who's going to talk about indicators and data sets in more detail.
Thank you, Dawn. Could we have the next slide? Okay, so as Dawn said, I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about indicators and how they're used in the model. So this slide is just showing the Attawapiskat River crossing. We have the western crossing and the eastern crossing represented in both of these little maps. The map on the left-hand side is representative of the area in hectares of water bodies crossed, so in this case, the river. And that's one input, one indicator that's put into the model, so whatever that actual hectare area is. The map on the right shows the boundary of the provincial park, and the number of hectares per crossing is also used as an input to the model. Next slide. So within the model, we have a weighting and scoring system. We have 5 factors, those umbrella categories that Dawn spoke about. And through input from the communities, and by communities I mean Webequie and Martin Falls First Nation, we as a team with their input decided that each factor should be weighted the same, meaning that one wasn't deemed more important than the other as it pertains to inputting data into the model. But there were certain indicators within those factors that were considered more important, and you can see in that red box below the scoring system. So there are certain indicators, if you will, that were considered more important. For example, under physical environment, you can see that area of water bodies is represented by 60% versus areas of groundwater recharge is at 20%. And this was also based on input from community members at the various meetings, open houses, live streams, radio shows that we had. Next slide. Now, after all of the inputs are in the model, we also have to think about what limitations there are while using the model. So the model's only as good as the data that we input, which is why we have input as much data as possible. And we're still getting data coming in from the field, and when we get more spatial data coming in, we add it and we keep rerunning the model. So when I say what's not in the model, I'm talking about data that can't be measured spatially. So it either has to be like a number of a length or an area, that type of thing. We can't put in something like, well, we feel like this is important. It has to be measurable. So one of the examples that I tend to give in these presentations is some of the Indigenous values, for example. It's hard to measure some of those areas, for example, berry picking sites or sacred sites, because that information is proprietary to the communities and we didn't get spatial data related to that. But we know that it's important and we have the general area that it's located in. So we've just put that under the umbrella of Indigenous values, and that'll come up in a couple of slides. So we have that on a map and we're able to take an area of it, but we can't really break it down beyond that umbrella of Indigenous values. All right, next slide, please. So this slide gives you just a table of our factors and criteria weighting. This one shows 4 of our factors, and it's broken down all the criteria that were used. So under Indigenous land use interests, we only have 3 criteria. So that's worth 33% each in the model. Whereas socioeconomic has, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. And it's each one of those is represented by 14%. You can see on the far right side, we have our weighting factor, and some of the factors that are weighted as 0 are just deemed not as important, or we didn't have information for that criteria. So there was no point in assigning a weight to it because we just didn't have the information. Next slide. This one is just the biological environment. You can see that there are many more criteria, so they're only being weighted at 5% each, but it's still, the factor is still overall weighted at 20%. We also only weighted each criteria by 1% because it was too difficult to figure out, or we didn't have enough input from the community what they wanted weighted more than the other. You can see that chimney swift and eastern whippoorwill were just had 0%, and that's because we don't have those species in the study area. But the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks insisted that we include them, despite the fact that their range doesn't extend as far north as our study area. All right, next slide. So when all the information is in the model and we get the spatial data spit out for us, this is how it looks. This is called a heat map. That little inset on the bottom left, you can see that the more preferred areas are dark green and the least preferred show up as orange. You can see some of the orange on the group B, blown up little inset, and even more so on the group A at the top right. You can see those darker green, darker orange areas, and those are indicating least preferred locations. All right, next slide. So this slide is detailing the numerical output of the model. And once again, we have least preferred as red and most preferred as green. These table of numbers are referring only to the very northernmost extent of our map, where we have the two corridor options at the top, F1 and F2. And you can see here that F1 on the west side is least preferred compared to F2. Next slide. All right, this slide is showing the comparison of indigenous land and resource uses in those little northerly segments. The map on the left is highlighting nesting areas for migratory birds. You can see that it's mostly just on the corridor option F2 on the right side, the east side. The center map shows historical trails. Again, it's mostly, well, it's hitting both corridor options. And the map on the right is just, as I referred to, Aboriginal cultural significant areas. It's not broken out by specifics, and you can see that corridor option F1 has more of those areas, and those are the areas we want to avoid, which is exactly why corridor F1 came up as the least preferred of those two options. Next slide. And this is showing the numerical output for the group B, which is in those little maps below with the purple alignments. These are the corridor options around the Attawapiskat River crossing. And we have 6 different options. And looking at those numerical tables above, you can see that just by looking at the colors, option 3 is coming out as the most preferred versus option 5 and 8, which are showing as the least preferred. And then the other 3 options kind of have a mixed bag, depending on which factor we are looking at. All right, next slide. All right, so this slide is just showing a blown up image of the Attawapiskat River crossing. This is the westerly crossing, and we added this slide in because we wanted to show how we use the community's input and their concerns related to the crossing of the Attawapiskat River. So originally, this is the western crossing. Originally, the crossing was a little bit further upstream, but the community expressed concerns about that original location because it was too close to some rapids, which were likely sturgeon spawning area. And so they asked us if we could shift it downstream. We looked at that. We decided that it was feasible from an engineering perspective, so we did that. So that's just highlighting that we were able to take the community's concerns into consideration and adjust the location of the corridor option. All right, and this is my final slide. Next. And after all of the inputs into the model and all of the data sources and all of it going back and forth, this is a map of our preferred corridor option. You can see it, it's the colored line. And the preferred crossing of the Attawapiskat River is the west side, as is staying off of the esker. So it's staying on more of the west side, and then it connects into the esker a little bit further north of the river. And then you can see that corridor option F2 up at the top is also the preferred option. So we want everybody to take a good look at that, because this is what we're here to talk about tonight, is the preferred corridor. There's the phone number again, 1-844-722-4300. Call us with questions or concerns. We'd like to hear from you and get your opinions. And just a reminder, this is the preferred corridor option that we're going to move forward with in the project. And now I am going to pass the presentation over to my colleague, Michelle.
Someone wanted a
and
clarification. Sorry about that.
oh, sorry.
John Aspert at Quickham said, "Did you just say Ottawa River?"
Did I say Ottawa? Attawapiskat. Did I really say Ottawa? Well, if I
I'm not
did, I
sure.
apologize. I meant Attawapiskat.
I'm just repeating the question so it can be clarified that.
It's the Attawapiskat River. If I said that, I apologize. That was a Freudian slip. All right, go ahead, Michelle.
Chimagwech and Ani Buzu. I'm Michelle, and I work on the project as the Indigenous Knowledge Program lead. What we're showing here on this slide is how we use and braid and weave together Indigenous knowledge throughout our environmental assessment process. So what we focus on, or what my team focuses on, is specifically the Aboriginal and/or Treaty Rights and Interest Assessment, and we rely on the Consultation and Engagement Program and the Indigenous Knowledge Program to inform our understanding of community rights and interests in the area and how they may be potentially impacted by the proposed Northern Road Link project. So for the purpose of the Indigenous Knowledge Program, our goal is to respectfully request information on land and resource use, areas of cultural practices, and rights and interests in the project study areas. In the following slides, I'll also show what those study areas look like. So currently, our Indigenous Knowledge Program is being offered to interested communities so that they can collect Indigenous knowledge information, as well as Indigenous land and resource use as they want, and share it with us as they see fit. So we hold that information when it's shared in confidence, and we'll only share what we are allowed to in our reports that we're working on for the assessment. So as I spoke earlier, Indigenous knowledge, when it's shared, will be braided together with Western scientific approaches to report on what we have here noted at the bottom, baseline conditions. These are what we use to then predict potential project impacts and determine mitigations and monitoring strategies for the project. So as shown on the diagram or the figure here, the Indigenous Knowledge Program will collect existing community information. So that's existing Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous land and resource use information, which can come from studies that communities have shared previously with other projects, or what is available, what we call the desktop, basically meaning what's information that's publicly available. The other way we are hoping for communities to participate is specifically through our Indigenous Knowledge Program, is where communities undertake project-specific studies that the communities want to share, and if communities also participate in our field programs as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for in our work, what we essentially have is that for this, it is a critical information base upon which we undertake our environmental assessments. And for the Indigenous Knowledge Program, because it feeds into our Aboriginal and/or tree rights and interests assessment work, we launched it as early as March 2022, where we reached out to communities and let them know this was a program that's available to them that they can utilize to participate with us in the environmental assessment for the Northern Rotaling project. As I said, it commenced in March 2022, and the timeline, as it stands, is in line with the project schedule. And the goal is to weave together Anishinaabe and Indigenous knowledge throughout the environmental assessment process. The slide here shows a really nice diagram of how we are hoping to reach that conclusion of the Indigenous Knowledge Program, but also in the virtual open house, there's a more detailed image that can be zoomed in and then you can look at in detail to see where we are with our Indigenous Knowledge Program. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for our Indigenous Knowledge Program, we our goal is to utilize Indigenous knowledge, weave it throughout the overall environmental assessment, and that includes utilizing Indigenous knowledge information and Anishinaabe information in all the project's valid components. The valid components are laid out here in this diagram and are essentially a term that we use in environmental assessments to mean aspects of the land like water, fish, medicines, and berries that are important to communities and that could be potentially affected by the project. So, as I noted earlier, scientific studies are done alongside community knowledge, including fieldwork as well, that are happening for the proposed corridor for the project. And these studies, or what we call valid components, fall within this broad group of disciplines or areas. For us, and what we're looking at specifically, for Aboriginal and/or tree rights and interest assessment, we are looking at two main valid components, and we're considering Anishinaabe and Indigenous knowledge in the existing condition setting to guide our assessment process. So these valid components, they're in the box in purple up at the top, and the first one. Sorry, go ahead.
We have a live question.
Sure. Yeah.
Laurent Joseph Robichaud just asked, where is the Attawapiskat community encampment situated on the river relative to your choice of crossing?
Oh, this is a question more so for Ange than myself, so I can ask Ange to answer it now or after. What would you prefer?
I
Ange,
can
do you want to
answer it
answer?
right now. Yeah, it is located. I'm gonna go back. Go back to that slide, Anders, that shows. Oh, where is it? Right at one of the first slides, slide 8.
8, okay.
Okay, we're bringing it up right now.
So that encampment is closer to the east crossing, the one on the right. It is, I don't know how to describe it. It's not within our 2-kilometer corridor, so it's west, from what I understand, it's west of that easterly crossing on the north side of the river. So there's a little cluster of islands in the middle of the river on the eastern crossing, and it's upstream of there on the north side, if that makes sense to you.
Unmute me. Sorry about that, Michelle. I might be interrupting with the live questions just as they come in. So
No worries.
don't be mad at me.
Not at all. We appreciate any and all questions that we get. All right. I was just speaking to the two valid components that our team deals with, which is under Aboriginal and/or tree rights and interests. So our first component is Indigenous use of lands and resources, so which refers to information related to sites and areas used for rights-based activities, including information on resources and access to these resources and what they mean to communities that utilize them. The other valid component that we consider in our assessment is cultural continuity and well-being, which focuses on information related to traditional practices and ways of knowing and being, connection to the land and culturally important sites, and includes information related to how culture is shared and how practices are passed through generations and the experiences around it. Next slide, please. So, as as a First Nation proponent, it is a goal of Martin Falls and Webequie First Nations to work with Indigenous communities to understand community-specific Aboriginal and/or tree rights and interests within the project study areas, and how these rights may be potentially impacted by the project. So, to do this, it is important that we develop a shared understanding of rights and interests asserted by Indigenous communities within the project's study areas. Through this shared understanding of rights, we will be better positioned to have discussions with communities about potential impacts to their rights as well. And then together, we can collaborate with them to develop strategies to avoid, reduce, or mitigate negative impacts while enhancing positive effects that can support communities in exercising their rights. Next slide, please. So earlier I had been talking about project study areas and what that means. Here is a map that shows those areas, the local and the regional study areas for Aboriginal and or tree rights and interests assessment. So the local study area, which is in teal or green or blue, as you can say, bluish green, is the local study area, which allows us to gather specific information that can be used to help design the project by avoiding or mitigating effects to sensitive features such as sacred areas, areas that are regularly used by communities, and such. So that is the area of where we look at the direct potential impacts of the project on communities' rights and interests. We also have in yellow the bigger regional study area, and this is for both valid components as well. And it allows us to gather information at a larger scale to better understand potential indirect effects on valid components, and what that means to Indigenous communities. So for this work, this is our overall study areas that we work with, and our goal is that to discuss these with communities where and when they're available, and we can come to them as well to discuss how we proceed with this work. And we're happy to discuss this approach with you at any time. So, Chimagwech, thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. If we can move to the next slide. That basically is our presentation for today. In terms of the next steps as we move forward, we will be finalizing the preferred corridor, and then we will focus on that as our study area going forward through the next couple of years to finalize the environmental assessment and impact assessment. So that's where we stand at the moment with regard to the project. And with that, Tony, I'll see if we have any further questions or comments.
Let me check the platforms very quickly. We have a few viewers on. Thanks for participating with us. And Lauren Joseph said thank you for getting back to him. And no, we have no more questions at this time.
Okay, thanks, Tony. So with that, on behalf of Michelle and Ange, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Feel free to contact us through our the contact information available on the website, northernroadlink.ca. You can see it on your screen there. And we'll be happy to respond. And if your community would like to have a meeting, either in person or virtually, or in whatever format you'd prefer, please don't be afraid to get in contact with us, and we can set that up. So with that, Big Witch, and We will see you soon, hopefully.